Hi everybody, it's Mr. Stevens here. I had a request from one of my students that he wanted to learn more about General Custer. So today we're going to start a new book, and that is Son of the Morning Star, Custer and the Little Bighorn by Evan S. Connell. This book it's a historical, creative nonfiction, and it is about the controversy surrounding Custer's last stand. And it tells the whole story, brilliantly reconstructing the events leading up to the Battle of the Little Bighorn and its aftermath. Like I said, it was written by Evan S. Connell, and it was published in 1984 by Harper Perennial. And in 1984, it was nominated for the National Book Critics Circle Award and was named by Time magazine as one of the 10 best books of 1984, and received the literary award of the Little Bighorn Associates. So, without further ado, let's jump right into Son of the Morning Star, Custer and the Little Bighorn by Evan S. Connell. And this is dedicated to Kurt Gentry. We do not see our hand in what happens, so we call certain events melancholy accidents. Stanley Cavell. Son of the Morning Star. Lieutenant James Bradley led a detachment of Crow Indian scouts up the Bighorn Valley during the summer of 1876. In his journal, he records that early Monday morning, June 26th, they saw the tracks of 4 ponies. Assuming the riders must be Sioux, they followed these tracks to the river and came upon one of the ponies, along with some equipment which evidently had been thrown away. An examination of the equipment disclosed, much to his surprise, that it belonged to some Crows from his own command who had been assigned to General Custer's regiment a few days earlier. While puzzling over this circumstance, Bradley discovered 3 men on the opposite side of the river. They were about 2 miles away and appeared to be watching. He instructed his scouts to signal with blankets that he was friendly, which they did, but for a long time there was no response. Then the distant men built a fire, messages were exchanged by smoke signal, and they were persuaded to come closer. They were indeed Crow scouts. Hairy Moccasin goes ahead, white man runs him. They would not cross the river, but they were willing to talk. Bradley did not want to believe the story they told, yet he had a feeling it was true. In his journal he states that he could only hope they were exaggerating, quote, that in the terror of the 3 fugitives from the fatal field their account of the disaster was somewhat overdrawn. The news deeply affected his own scouts. One by one they went aside and sat down, rocking to and fro, weeping and chanting. Apart from relatives and friends of the slain soldiers, he later wrote, quote, there were none in this whole horrified nation of 40 millions of people to whom the tidings brought greater grief. Bradley at once rode back to his commandant, General Alfred Terry, and repeated what the Crows had said. Terry, accompanied by Colonel John Gibbon, was surrounded by aides, did not join the chorus of disbelief, but sat on his horse with a thoughtful expression, quote, biting his lower lip and looking at me as though he by no means shared in the wholesale skepticism of the flippant members of his staff. The column then resumed its march, and shortly after noon crossed into the valley of the Little Bighorn. A white scout named Muggins Taylor, described as a gambler and professional hunter, was directed to look around. When he came back, he reported the smoke of a large fire up ahead. Colonel Gibbon thought this was good news because it meant one of 2 things. Custer had taken the Indian village, or the Indians themselves were burning it. General Terry offered $200 to anybody who could reach Custer. Taylor and another scout named Bostwick decided to try. Both returned in a little while, saying nobody could get through. Horsemen materialized on a ridge, and though field glass, it could be seen that several of them wore blue uniforms, meaning they must belong to Custer's regiment, possibly his Arikara scouts. Lieutenant Charles Rowe led a troop of cavalry forward. Rowe advanced cautiously, uncertain whether he was approaching Arikars or Sioux. He dispatched a sergeant to find out. Advance, tie a handkerchief to your gun, wave it, and we will see what happens, said Rowe. but just then a party of at least 60 United States cavalrymen, or what resembled cavalrymen, proceeding by twos with a guidon flying, rode into view. A second cavalry unit then merged with the first, and Lieutenant Rowe understood they were hostile Indians dressed in army clothing. With this frightful mass to contemplate, it seems odd he did not rescind his order to wave a handkerchief at them, but he did not. Quote, I immediately ordered the sergeant to move forward, saying that we would support him. The obedient sergeant commandeered 2 enlisted men, and these guinea pigs galloped ahead while Rowe and the others followed. Very soon a familiar noise could be heard. Pop, 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 pop. Neither the intrepid sergeant nor his companions were hit, but the plateau was by now carpeted with Indians, and Lieutenant Rowe thought it wise to retreat. Until this withdrawal, most of the troops with Gibbon and Terry thought the disciplined blue-clad riders must belong to Custer. Only a few remained suspicious. Although the riders maintained cavalry formation, Lieutenant John McBlain noted, quote, there was an indefinable something in their movements that did not appear altogether natural. Captain Henry Freeman bet a cigar they were hostile, despite rumors that the 2 of them had been seen shaking hands with Rowe, and in his journal Freeman commented somewhat dryly that he had won a cigar. While discussing the day's events around a campfire, most infantrymen predicted more unpleasant news, whereas the cavalrymen, emotionally related to Custer's 7th, argued that if indeed there had been a fight, Custer must have been victorious. Quote, so obstinate is human nature, Bradley wrote, that there were actually men in the command who lay down to sleep that night in the firm conviction, notwithstanding all the disclosures of the day, that there was not an Indian in our front. They could explain ingeniously every circumstance that had a contrary look, and to argue with them in this was worse than useless. Tuesday morning, not an Indian could be seen. Farther up the valley, on a hillside east of the river, lay a number of pale, unidentifiable objects, which were assumed to be dead buffalo. Several dark objects among these carcasses were thought to be buffalo skins left behind when the Indians fled. Bradley crossed the river to investigate. Not long after his departure, the column reached the site of an Indian encampment so recently deserted that the fire beds had not cooled. A few skulking dogs loped away when the army approached. Debris littered the ground: shotguns, axes, blankets, soup bowls, horn spoons, brass kettles, hammers, coffee mills, chunks of meat, antique pistols, a grindstone, tin cups, a small bellows, saddles, and buffalo robes, along with such incongruous items as photographs, letters, and china dishes. Wounded horses from Custer's regiment and various pieces of army equipment were also discovered in the village, and from an upright pole dangled 3 human heads bound together with wire, all 3 so badly burned they could not be identified. Gibbon's surgeon, Dr. Holmes Paulding, noticed Lieutenant James Porter's buckskin shirt. Quote, poor fellow, Dr. Paulding wrote in his diary, there was a hole under the right shoulder and blood over the rest. Found Yates' 7th Cavalry, marked on a pair of gloves, under clothing of Jack Sturgis with his spurs and traces of other old friends and of the gallant regiment. There were immense fresh trails of lodge poles leading towards the ravines and bluffs, and along all of them packs, travois, lodge poles, and utensils dropped or hastily cut loose. Several lodges had not been dismantled. Terry's soldiers at first thought this was because the hostiles had been in a hurry to escape, but inside of each of these lodges lay 1 or more dead warriors, each handsomely dressed, and, as it was the burial custom, wearing moccasins with ceremonial beaded soles. About this time, Lieutenant Bradley returned from the other side of the river to say that the dark objects on the hillside, thought to be buffalo skins, were, in fact, dead horses. What had been mistaken for skinned buffalo carcasses were the naked bodies of Custer's men. Bradley had counted 197 dead soldiers. This news paralyzed the advancing army. A mule packer in Rowe's company, Private William H. White, said that for a quarter of an hour there was very little talking. The column then proceeded through the valley in an attempt to learn what had happened. As the troops marched south, they noticed occasional clusters of arrows standing up like cactuses. Before long, they understood that each cluster would mean another dead cavalryman. Moving figures could be discerned on a hilltop some distance ahead, rushing around in such excitement that they were assumed to be Indians, and with them a herd of ponies. A detachment of soldiers guided by Muggins Taylor went forward. After a while, Terry's army caught up with this unit and found the officer in charge talking with some emissaries from the hill, who turned out to be Lieutenants Luther Hare and George Wallace of the 7th Cavalry Battalion, commanded by Major Marcus Reno. It developed that Reno's battalion had been surrounded by Sioux and Cheyenne for 2 days, Sunday and Monday, until late Monday afternoon, when the Indians dismantled their portable village and moved south towards the Bighorn Mountains. What had appeared from the distance to be a pony herd was the 7th Cavalry mule train. Reno's messengers were thankful that Terry and Gibbon had arrived, but they were puzzled because they thought this column was led by General George Custer. They said there had been no word from him since he divided the command and rode off with 5 companies early Sunday afternoon. They were stunned to hear that everybody who went with Custer was dead, and they had trouble realizing that their 2-day ordeal was a peripheral fight. 52 of Reno's men were wounded, which gave Dr. Paulding plenty of work. In a letter to his mother sometime afterwards, he sounds bemused by the resilience of the survivors. Although Custer's death shocked them, he wrote, they got over it quickly and became rather cheerful. All right, and we will end there for the day. There is no chapters in this book. It is basically a single story. So we'll just kind of stop at a good stopping place, and we'll pick up in the next video right where we left off. I hope you guys are enjoying it, and I hope you continue to enjoy it, and make sure you like and subscribe so you don't miss any parts of Son of the Morning Star, Custer and Little Bighorn by Evan S. Connell. Thanks for joining. Bye.